following reading is an excerpt from Reverend Marta Valentine's Sunday sermon at last year's General Assembly. When our theme, The Power of We, was revealed, many from the historically marginalized communities immediately asked, who is the we? It felt like the assumption was, it is all of us Unitarian Universalists. But is it? When many of us from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities experience a kind of Unitarian Universalism that is neither what we are told it is, nor how we know it could be. Is it when our trans family is repeatedly muted? Is it when our people living with seen and unseen disabilities are made invisible anyway? Is it when Christian UUs and military chaplains feel like they have to be in the closet? My Black, Indigenous, and people of color families have been pillars of strength, tenacity, and fortitude. You have had generosity of soul, which has allowed your spirits to pull whatever needs to be pulled out of an already empty hat. Because we love this faith. Its theologies have saved us, and we want to save our children and our children's children from an increasingly frightening world. We know our white siblings are being called to pick up this work, and until they do, we also know we need each other to survive. I want to thank us for our ability to keep showing up, even after we've been insulted, talked down to, overlooked for promotions, unjustly been terminated, had our truths that were courageously spoken trampled on and challenged, had our hearts torn to pieces. And we've survived on the glue that is our love for each other to set our beautiful, sensitive, strong, powerful hearts back together to face another day. We came and fell in love with the Unitarian and Universalist theologies, but clashed with the culture. This is not a pity party, but it is to say that we do it all because this faith is ours too. And our is all reaching, calling everyone in. This is about ministering with new ideas in new cups to thirsty, thirsty people. And I don't mean just newcomers who find us. I mean those of us who have been here all along. We have become so thirsty for the faith we know this could be and should be. The presence of all the historically marginalized UUs that has made us open and affirming has added a depth that only we could have. It is time to throw out our exceptional identity and humble ourselves. The question is, are we ready to be better for our own people? Because the world includes every person in our faith, many of whom have been microaggressed right out the door. It is the silent, revolving door that many do not want to acknowledge aloud. It is time now to ask ourselves, who are we, really? Which Unitarian Universalism are we taking into our future? That was the Reverend Marta Valentine at the 2019 UUA General Assembly. Now, Reverend Valentine asks a very key question. Who are we really as Unitarian Universalists? Well, if you Google Unitarian Universalism, and the Wikipedia page pops up, you'll read the following. Unitarian Universalism is a liberal religion characterized by a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. What? Our fourth principle, yes? Unitarian Universalists assert no creed, but instead are unified by their shared search for spiritual growth. Sounds good. As such, their congregations include many atheists, agnostics, and theists within their membership. The roots of Unitarian Universalism lie in liberal Christianity, specifically Unitarianism and Universalism. Unitarian Universalists state that from these traditions comes a deep regard for intellectual freedom and inclusive love. Congregations and members seek inspiration and derive insight from all major world religions. This sounds pretty accurate to me. What about you guys? Yeah? Okay. Well, the fourth principle, which they quoted, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, attracted me to Unitarian Universalism back in my mid-20s. The ability to ask the big questions in a safe space is what I value about my chosen faith over the orthodox Christianity of my upbringing. Yet, in my 6 years of attending General Assembly, including last year's, I have heard repeatedly from UUs with marginalized identities that they do not find congregations to be safe spaces to be themselves, much less explore and express their spirituality. Reverend Valentin said, "Many of us from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities experience a kind of Unitarian Universalism that is neither what we are told it is, nor how we know it could be." And that's a big problem for Unitarian Universalism. Well, for at least two reasons, as far as I can see. First, the population of the United States is becoming less white, European American. According to the Census Bureau, by 2044, more than half of all Americans are projected to belong to a minority group. Now, if UU congregations on the whole are not safe spaces for people of color, then those people will not join our movement, and our movement will decline, one congregation at a time. The second reason, and this is more critical in my opinion, if UU congregations do not practice what we preach, we lose credibility as a faith tradition. Now, we all hate hypocrisy, don't we? I know I do. But the members of the upcoming generations are especially sensitive to it. So this isn't a question of Unitarian Universalism thriving, but of it surviving. As chair of the membership committee for my congregation, I have witnessed the exodus of young and transgendered and people of color from my church because of something a lay member rather than the minister said or did. In one case, it was an insensitive remark to a transgendered couple during the coffee hour. In another, it was the treatment of a young couple that they received during a tree planting. Now, these remarks did not come out of any conscious racial or transphobic animus. They were likely off-the-cuff remarks based on mistaken cultural assumptions. But it isn't just classist, racist, homophobic, xenophobic, or transphobic remarks from fellow congregants that turns people away. I've noticed an anti-religious sentiment in UU congregations. as if Unitarian Universalism, in the words of Reverend Christine Robinson, is an alternative to religion, not a religion in and of itself. I have had members resign because our church was not spiritual enough. One former member told our minister they needed a church that was more Christ-centered. Another told me that they felt uncomfortable expressing their spiritual beliefs and practices and needed a space where they could openly pray without being ridiculed. One member, a former Catholic like me, recounted an incident some years ago when a lay person donned a robe and posed as Jesus during the worship service. Now, she didn't find him dressing up as Jesus to be offensive, so much as his wry portrayal of a deeply spiritual Jew who courageously stood up to the ancient Roman Empire. In fact, he died for it. Now, this member stayed at our church because this was her community. But it made me wonder how many people new to that church, or even Unitarian Universalism, came that Sunday, and if they ever came back. Moreover, when I think about how important faith in Jesus has been to many African Americans, I can see how this seeming rejection of Jesus in UU churches may well feel like a rejection of African American culture, and by extension, African Americans themselves. This may explain, in part, why the majority of members of many UU congregations are European American, in spite of a sincere and conscious desire to be a diverse, multicultural faith. If UUs consist primarily of white, older, affluent, and educated people, can we really say with a straight face that we are multicultural and diverse? I remember when I explained Unitarian Universalism to one of my professors, an African American Christian pastor, and she asked me, why do UUs want to be multicultural? I mean, is it because you truly value diversity? Or is it because you want to feel better about being white? Then she expressed her truth to me. When she hears the term multicultural, she gets nervous. In her experience, organizations that call themselves multicultural turn out to be toxic havens of white supremacy, no matter how sincere the members of these organizations are about anti-racism. I took her point. It is the same point that UUs of color, transgendered UUs, Black UUs, and other UUs with marginalized identities like Reverend Marta Valentin have been making for decades. In her sermon at General Assembly, Reverend Valentin said, UU's inability to deal with open conflict has led to more conflict. UUs who refuse to understand how their lack of engaging the work causes microaggressions to spill out of them, like unexpected spit in the faces of people who talk or act like me. These UUs hang on to the supreme whiteness of being at all costs and have not been able to grasp that we are all swimming in poisoned proverbial waters. Unquote. That's heavy. So like Reverend Valentin's sermon, my professor's questions and comments, though hard to hear, gave me important insights into current UU identity and culture. Now, I don't think either of these women are saying that UUs are racist or that multiculturalism is bad. After all, the United States has always been and will continue to be multicultural. Now, I think they are both inviting us to examine our cultural assumptions. That's what seminary has been for me. In the last 2 years, I have come to believe that Unitarian Universalism, in its quest to be all-inclusive, has tried to be everything for everyone, and in the process has forgotten its core identity, at least to some extent. Again, Reverend Valentine. She observed, "We've lost sight of the sacred stories that preserve the soul of what Unitarian Universalism set out to be before the world got its hands on it." Powerful stuff. Well, I think that collective amnesia is what is preventing us as a movement from becoming the beloved multicultural community we wish to be. To go forward into the future, we must look back to our collective past and reclaim what has been forgotten, a process known by the African diaspora as Sankofa. We must become, as Reverend Valentine put it, archaeologists of our collective hearts and respectively sift through the blood-soaked rubble. That excavation begins with understanding that both Unitarian and Universalism began as solidly Christian denominations. UUs have been known as the Protestants of the Protestants, in the words of Unitarian minister Henry Whitney Bellows, because they offered an alternative interpretation of Jesus' death and, more importantly, life. Both Unitarians and Universalists have been questioning the dominant Christian orthodoxy since well before the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, and they were called heretics for it. Consequently, both Unitarians and Universalists have been persecuted, banished, and even killed for their beliefs, including Michael Servetus, who was burned at the stake in 1553. In spite of this persecution, UUs have persisted. In this country, both Unitarians and Universalists have been outspoken advocates for social justice. UUs were involved in the abolitionist movement in the 19th century and the civil rights movement in the 20th century. People like Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzu lost their lives for the cause of justice. But to be clear, their advocacy was based upon their free-thinking interpretations of the Greek and Hebrew scriptures, because both Unitarians and Universalists understood themselves to be Christians. Yet something happened to Unitarian Universalism in the United States over the course of the last 200 years. Gradually, UUs wandered away from the table of Christology and towards secular humanism, especially since 1968. Now, there are many good reasons for that, but I must remind you that secular humanism has an orthodoxy of its own, one that seems to disparage and dismiss spirituality or theology. Moreover, humanists are just as prone to feelings of exceptionalism as theists. That's problematic, if not hypocritical. How can we call ourselves a religion and refer to congregations as churches if there is effectively a cultural aversion to God talk? Are we really being inclusive by excluding references to God or Jesus from our worship services and programs? Is it inclusive to shush people up if they want to talk about that? I would argue not, when many people who come to our congregations came from Christianity in some form. When visitors come to my congregation, I hear them express a desire for a spiritual home, a safe space to explore something greater than themselves while still being themselves. As a lay leader of a UU congregation and now a seminarian, I sense there is this thirst for an alternative to the dominant Christian paradigm, the kind of thirst Reverend Valentine referred to in her sermon. But here's the paradox. To become a multicultural and to harness the power of we, the theme for General Assembly, UUs must commit to being a religion and embracing our heritage. Now, I'm not suggesting that UUs today call themselves Christian, unless of course they feel they're Christian, or suddenly adopt a creed. That would not be very UU. But I am suggesting that UUs do the work of reclaiming, in the words of Reverend Valentine, quote, the soul of what Unitarian Universalism set out to be before the world got its hands on it. We need to be humble and follow the lead of our UU siblings of color and other marginalized groups who have shown resilience time and time again. We need to engage in theological discourse and deep conversation on spirituality for UUs today. We need to articulate a firm theological and ethical position for the world. We need to get serious about walking the talk of anti-oppression. We need to be better right here in our congregations, right now. Fear of conflict is not an excuse from engaging in the work. We have much to lose, beginning with our fellow UUs with marginalized identities who have been here all along. But more than that, we stand to lose Unitarian Universalism. I have hope, however, because of the resilience of countless Unitarians and Universalists, the resilience that they have shown over the centuries of persecution and struggle for justice. We can be better if we embrace all of who we are and have been. May it be so. Amen.